Okay. Dear colleagues, I hope that you can hear us. I hope that you can hear us. Just a second. Okay, that's. Oops. Something wrong with the camera, obviously. Well, okay. Just an audio, but okay. So at least Nikolai can be seen. I hope you can hear us. I hope you can hear us. I see that the video is blurred at the moment, at least for the audience, but not for Nikolai, and not for the speaker. And this is an event of the Smolny Beyond Borders program, and I'm very pleased with today's event. My name is Philip Tetchin. I'm a manager of the Smolny Beyond Borders, staff member at Bard College Berlin. The event is taking place, as you can see, in a hybrid format, offline here at Bard College Berlin, one floor above the office of the Smolny Without Borders project, and online on Zoom and on the YouTube channel Smolny Beyond Borders. Smolny Beyond Borders is, until now, primarily an online initiative, online education project, which was initiated and implemented by a team of former faculty members of Smolny College, or the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences, those who left the Russian Federation due to the war, who did not agree with the policies of the Putin regime, and who want to preserve, however small, the tradition of Russian liberal arts education currently in exile. In the current semester, we have about 20 courses as part of the project, and all courses are implemented with the help of our colleagues at Bard and accredited by Bard College. And we're very thankful for this. This week, we will announce registration for courses in the summer semester. There will be around 8 courses offered, implemented with the support of the Open Society University Network. We plan to open a 2-year online associate degree program as part of the Smolny Beyond Borders project, and the admissions campaign for the first cohort will begin, I hope, in the fall, while we'll also retain the opportunity to enroll in individual courses as it happened before. Until now, all our courses are free for students, and our target audience is, first of all, displaced students who have left or who are planning to leave Russia, Belarus, and other places with similar situations, and who do not have an opportunity to continue their studies in a usual setting or are not satisfied with the options they currently have. I'm proud to introduce our speaker today. Nikolai Kopasov is a distinguished professor of the practice at the School of History and Sociology and the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Institute of Technology. Previously, he worked at Johns Hopkins University, Emory University, Helsinki University, and École des Hautes Études Sciences Sociales in Paris. What is the most important fact for us is that from 1998, since its creation, and until 2009, Nikolai Kopasov was a founding dean of Smolny College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Moreover, he was a principal force behind Smolny intellectual community, and the creation of the college itself was preceded by the foundation of the Seminar of the Critique of Social Sciences. This was an impressive intellectual forum where the Smolny Circle established itself. Nikolai is the author of a number of books, including De l'Imagination Historique, 2015 from EHSS, Memory Laws, Memory Wars, 2018 from Cambridge University Press. And concluding my short remarks, and again, once again expressing that I'm really honored that Nikolai is giving this talk. I want to cite here a famous French historian and thinker, Pierre Nora, who gave the following characteristic to Nikolai as an author of the Memory Wars. Nikolai Kopasov is, by his personal experience and his intellectual culture, and mostly by his talent as both a philosopher and a historian, the most well-equipped man to dominate such a large and topical subject. The subject of this talk is how the world has changed since we founded Smolny and Seminar of Social Science, the Critique of Social Sciences. It's probably not as large and topical issue, but I'm sure not less important for not only for me, but for our today's audience. Thanks a lot. Nikolai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to have an opportunity to exchange ideas with those who are present here in this room and also who have joined us online. It's a very kind introduction, Philip, and Pierre Nora certainly overappreciated my very modest skills and my modest knowledge. The thing is that he wrote these things, these phrases about my book, Memory Wars, and my interest in this topic was absolutely derived from our discussions with Pierre Nora. So he, I guess, wanted just to support me following in his steps, trying to understand the origins and the function of memory laws in democratic society. Now, my topic, as Philip has just said, is how the world has changed since we founded Smolny. And let me begin by a disclaimer. I certainly do not imply that the world has changed because we founded Smolny, post hoc known as Proctor hoc. And despite my pretentious title, I will focus on much more concrete, if not technical, aspects of recent transformations to which my subtitle, evoking the seminal critique of social sciences, refers. May I remind you that the seminar was a starting point from which Smolny began. It began at St. Petersburg State University a year before Smolny was founded, and the core of the group, which later founded Smolny, really met many for the first time within in the framework of this seminar. And a great deal of the enthusiasm for liberal education that in the late 1990s and the early 2000s was typical of many of those who helped build Smolny originated from the dissatisfaction with the state of the art in social and human sciences, including their increasing specialization. Liberal education looked then is one of the ways to return to those sciences' original project, designed as a framework of the so-called Humboldtian University. I do not need, of course, to remind you, especially speaking here in Berlin, that liberal education also comes back to this model, inspired as it was by the notion of Bildung, or intellectual and moral self-perfectioning, through the familiarization with and interiorization of the culture of European humanism. What I would like to discuss today is to what extent the ideals and hopes that were, at least to some extent and at some point, an important driving force of Smolny College project are still relevant today, and where the challenges to them have come from in recent decades, the decades marked by a deep crisis of liberal democracy, of which both liberal education and social and human sciences were and still are important cultural underpinnings. My reflections will refer primarily to the discipline I'm most familiar with, that is history, with some occasional incursions into sociology and political science. But before I turn to my topic, let me make two general observations that will, I hope, better explain my strategy. The first preliminary observation concerns the role of ideas in history. As some of you know, I'm an intellectual historian, and my presentation today will be about intellectual history. What I said a minute ago can be interpreted in the sense that intellectual history is of secondary importance for the development of our societies. In fact, I think the opposite is the case. And I cannot agree more with John Maynard Keynes when he claims, I quote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." I would add some historians to the list of those whose ideas rule the world. I will argue that the new attitudes to the past and the new ways of history writing that came to dominate Western culture at the turn of the 21st century are largely responsible for the current decline of democracy and the coming of the post-truth age. My second preliminary observation is about Russia's role in the story I'm going to tell. Smolny was, of course, founded in Russia, and one of its main goals was to contribute to the democratization of the country by educating global democratic citizens and changing then prevailing attitudes to what human beings are about. All such attempts have miserably failed, which does not mean that they must be assessed today as completely meaningless and should be abandoned. On the contrary, it is important to continue them, even if the chances for success are close to zero in any foreseeable future. Just a couple of days ago, I participated here in Berlin in a conference sponsored by the Memorial Society, which discussed, among other things, numerous grassroots attempts to counter the Kremlin's politics of historical memory. It was obvious from our discussions that our colleagues, most of whom are really very young, are doing something absolutely important for Russia's most likely very remote and by no means guaranteed, yet not impossible, democratic future. Like most other projects seeking to democratize Russia, Smolny College fell victim to the emerging authoritarian regime. I think one could have predicted this outcome long before it actually happened. Beyond a certain point, the collaboration with the increasingly anti-democratic and anti-Western regime was probably a mistake, although an understandable one, because predictions of the future can never be certain, and people usually don't want to believe in the worst-case scenarios coming true. But speaking more generally, the formation of Putin's authoritarian regime and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which has made everyone realize that this regime, what this regime is about, must be considered in a much broader framework than Russia's national history. To prevent a possible misunderstanding, I'm not trying to minimize Putin's responsibility for the authoritarian turn in Russian politics and the war in Ukraine. I'm simply saying that in the highly interconnected world of the present, there are no more local problems, as Paul Valéry argued in 1931. The intellectual, cultural, and political climate in which Putinism has become possible is only partly of Putin's own making, nor is it an outcome of exclusively Russian developments. Kremlin's ideologists have for decades been diligent readers of Western literature that is critical of modernity, rationalism, liberal democracy, and master narratives. They have used this literature widely in their propaganda and have contributed to the spread of these ideas across the world. However, the engine of recent intellectual transformations operates far outside Russia. In 2014, Barack Obama famously said, I quote, "Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness." End of quote. I wish he had not said that, because it is very likely that these words had encouraged Putin to show that Russia is much more dangerous than Obama thought. But for the rest, Obama was right. Russia is indeed a regional power, and it is indeed acting out of weakness, which should not certainly make us sympathize with it. For quite some time, namely for more than a century, Russia's fates have been largely determined by worldwide processes, which is certainly true of many other countries as well. But few countries have such a strong tendency to consider themselves and to be considered enigmas, and exceptions from all rules. This makes it particularly important to look for a model of causation, which would go beyond the national history framework with regard to this country. Indeed, the 1917 revolution was, to a very considerable extent, due to the unfortunate import of European ideas to Russia and the success of the Bolshevik regime in maintaining its power in the isolated and half-destroyed country was also largely due to the enthusiasm of its fellow travelers across the world, who worked hard and not without success to convince their governments and nations that the communist repressions were fake news and that the Soviet Union had created a more efficient social model than Western capitalism. In turn, the collapse of the Soviet system was also an outcome of the developments in the West, at least as much as in the Soviet Union itself. Let me quote from what I think is the best available analysis of the Soviet collapse, namely Stephen Kotkin's book, Armageddon Averted. I quote, "The Second World War victory over fascism and the post-war capitalist economic boom, consumer revolution, massive investments in social welfare, and decolonization meant that Soviet socialism could not provide a better standard of living, a more substantial safety net, and just society, or a superior political order to that of capitalist welfare state democracies." End of quote. In other words, communism lost competition with capitalism in the eyes of most people in both the West and the East. Many observers have argued that economic difficulties per se cannot explain the Soviet collapse. What can suggest, I think, that the highly positive image of the West, which came to dominate most minds across the world, was the decisive factor that conditioned the decline and fall of communism. I cannot agree more with this interpretation, but what I think follows from it is that the current rise of the authoritarian regimes, including in Russia, and both right-wing and left-wing populisms, the successes, respectively, of fascism and communism, has also been conditioned to a very significant extent by the decay of the ideal image of the West in Russia and in many other non-Western countries, and most importantly, most tragically, in the West itself. To be sure, this epochal change has been produced by various factors having to do with the formation of a new type of capitalism, the decline of the welfare state, the formation of neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. But as I said earlier, as an intellectual historian, I will focus on the evolution of ideas rather than economic and social structures. In a nutshell, my point is that a change in Western historical consciousness that occurred at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century has significantly contributed to the erosion of democracy in the same way as the emergence of modern historical consciousness at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century was a sine qua non precondition of the formation of liberal democracy in the West. The rest of my presentation is based on some of my recent and not so recent publications, as well as on the book that I'm currently about to finish. The title of the book is The War in Ukraine and the Future of History. In this book, I examine the conflict between universalism and particularism in modern thought and the interconnections between liberal democracy and the modern idea of history. In particular, I discuss the recent transition from critical history to the identitarian paradigm, and here is my argument about this transition in a few short words. The identitarian paradigm is intimately interconnected with memory politics or history politics, which is a hallmark of our time. The concept of history politics was invented here in Germany in 1986 in the context of the debate over the uniqueness of the Holocaust. To be sure, using the past for present-day politics is as old as history and politics are. Yet, the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st centuries witnessed the emergence of not just one concept, but an entire group of interrelated concepts related to the politics of the past. The terms memory, cultural memory, historical memory, identity, and heritage, in the sense of cultural heritage, did not become core concepts in historians' vocabulary until the 1980s, even though these words existed long before that. The expressions duty to remember and memory wars came into common use in the 1990s. The term memory laws was coined in 2005, although most types of such laws were invented during the French Revolution, and some come back to antiquity. The almost simultaneous emergence of these concepts suggests that something could indeed change in the centuries-long practice of using the past for the sake of the present. Not coincidentally, all these terms were coined after the beginning of the so-called memory boom, or the rise of memory, which is conventionally dated to the 1970s and 1980s. One possible way of understanding the novelty of present-day memory politics is to consider it in the context of the late 20th century crisis of history. In contrast to the concepts just discussed, the expression crisis of history, or even crisis of the social sciences, is not new. Historians and philosophers often complained about what they viewed as cultural and intellectual decline, and when we founded the Seminary Critique of Social Sciences, we were among those who complained about that. However, it was not until the 1980s and 1990s that the theme of the crisis of history became central to the historians' debates. To be sure, in the 2000s and 2010s, these debates died down somewhat. However, historians stopped talking about the crisis of their discipline, not so much because they decided it had been overcome, but rather because the theme had exhausted itself. Indeed, little could be done about what, at the turn of the 21st century, has become a prevailing practice of history writing. Moreover, attempts have been made to present the crisis as a liberation from oppressive certainties. The problem is, however, that despite some elements of progress, the new state of the art in historiography suffers from no less oppressive certainties, some of which are closely interconnected with memory and identity politics. Many crises have liberating aspects, but do not necessarily result in freedom becoming a new law of life. Today, 40 years after the diagnosis of the crisis of history, one can speak about a paradigm change in historiography that occurred at the turn of the 21st century. Let me now clarify the terms critical history and the identitarian paradigm. By critical history, I mean professional historiography inspired by the ideal of objectivity, understanding history as a relatively autonomous field, to use Pierre Bourdieu's term, of intellectual and social practices, seeking to reduce the impact of politics on the historian's craft, and developing increasingly sophisticated research methods. This form of historiography began taking shape in the 19th century, with important antecedents going back to the 16th and 17th centuries. It reached its highest point with the formation of the French Annales School in the 1930s and came to international prominence in the 1960s and 1970s. I call this model critical history because of its dependence on the tradition of critical, that is, neo-Kantian philosophy, and more generally critical thinking, Humboldtian tradition. Both critical history and the neo-Kantian tradition had little to do with the so-called critical theory, classically represented by the Frankfurt School, which was far more to the left. In other words, I use the term critical in the sense of intellectual rather than social criticism. Critical history combined moderate epistemological and cultural relativism with the belief in universal human nature and a soft version of liberal master narrative. It was based on productive, to my mind, tension between universalism and particularism, which was fundamental for democratic ideology since its inception at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. This was a soft and indirect form of politicizing the past, conformable with the pluralistic and universal nature of liberal democracy. In contrast, by the identitarian paradigm, I mean the subjugation of historiography and other social sciences to the purposes of identity politics. In the 1970s and 1980s, critical history came under attack, directed primarily against its universalism and moderate epistemological optimism. The identitarian paradigm began taking shape simultaneously with the decline of critical history, the collapse of master narratives, and the rise of memory. It became a leading model of history writing in the early years of the 20th century, at least in the United States. Identitarianism is often used in a narrow sense to refer to the far-right movement, which began with the formation of the identitarian bloc in France in 2003. However, it is hardly possible to avoid using this term in a broader sense of identity politics practiced by both anti-globalist ethno-populist groups on the right and the anti-discrimination minority movements on the left. The proximity between the far left to far right movements is no new phenomenon. In recent years, it has become especially evident. It has given rise to the so-called horseshoe theories, claiming that those movements are closer to each other than either is to the political center. This doesn't certainly mean that there is no difference between left-wing and right-wing populists, including with regard to the memory politics. However, the dynamics just described is relevant for understanding the transition from critical to identitarian history. The dominant forms of politicizing the past are intimately linked today to the rise of memory and identity politics. An essential difference between critical history and the identitarian paradigm is that the former emerged primarily from within academia, which in the 1920s and 1930s sought to overcome the excessive politicization of the past by national historiographers, while the latter has primarily non-academic roots. It was born out of the social movements on both the left and the right, and in recent years it has been powerfully carried by social media. Academia half-heartedly, because it is split on the issue, attempted to resist the invasion and predictably has had little success. The decline of the autonomy of the academic sphere is part of the erosion of social fields and the blurring of the boundaries between them, which is often considered the essence of postmodernism. The emergence of the identitarian paradigm and the decomposition of the relatively depoliticized critical history undermined the unstable balance between relativism and epistemological optimism and between universalism and particularism. Let me emphasize that the connection with identity politics stems from the structural features of the identitarian paradigm. By shifting the emphasis towards relativism and particularism, the new paradigm has contributed to the repoliticization of the past in significantly new ways. The rise of memory and identity politics has powerfully transformed the structure of both historical discourse and the historical profession. The historiographic landscapes, previously dominated by economic, social, and cultural history, which sought to explain social dynamics, are currently informed, especially in the US, by research fields organized around particularistic identities or subjective perceptions of the social world, be they gender studies or post-colonial studies. These historiographic developments run strictly parallel to the proliferation of identity politics based mainly on the often invented collective memories. Most observers identified the main aspects of the crisis of history at the end of the 20th century as the decline of the belief in the objectivity of historical knowledge and the fragmentation of historical discourse. In fact, the fragmentation of history meant nothing other than the decay of the master narratives or the collapse of global or total history. At the same time, the proponents of the linguistic term held that our representations of the past represent only the linguistic protocols in our minds, to quote Hayden White's famous metahistory. Objectivity came to be commonly seen as a noble dream. The expression is, of course, Peter Novick's, which masks history's real goal of legitimizing existing power relationships. There was a close interconnection between the two aspects of the crisis of history, which reflected the new intellectual climate formed under the influence of postmodernism. Indeed, postmodernism called into question all certainties and all global models. It insisted on the context dependence of all knowledge and the role of local logics. This marked, if not the much discussed end of history, at least the end of the two most ambitious projects of global and total history in 20th century historiography, Marxism and the analysis school. The crisis of the future and the rise of memory are interconnected with the recent so-called historic turn in social and human sciences. Some observers argue that history, not social theories, has been our primary instrument for explaining social phenomena since the 1970s and 1980s, when the memory boom began. Complex contextual explanations have replaced, this historians argue, theoretical models in disciplines ranging from history and literary criticism to sociology and political science. Let me refer here to the stimulating reflections of Terence MacDonald and William Sue. The new historicism is perhaps the best known, but not the only manifestation of this tendency. These developments can be interpreted as signs of further historicization of Western thought. As a historian, I could only welcome this transformation, were it not for the coincidence between the historic turn advocated by some colleagues and the crisis of history deplored by others. Can both diagnoses be correct? Are we not thinking more historical today in a world that has lost confidence in history as an organizing framework of human experience? As Frederick Jameson, not my favorite author, once noted, it is safest to grasp the concept of postmodern as an attempt to think the present historically in an age that has forgotten how to think historically in the first place. The end of quote. It is hard to imagine what the second part of this phrase refers to, if not the collapse of global history. Traditional historicism presupposed a certain idea of global history or master narrative, using some image of the future to explain the meaning of the past and the present. Within this framework, legitimation through history implied a reference to a master narrative, which allowed the disclosure of the concrete historical place and universal meaning of a given political or social system. Should we not speak today of a new historicism as a rapidly spreading style of thinking that is more profound than a relatively innocuous call to historicize the texts? The modern idea of history presupposed a balance and a tension between historical relativism and universalism embodied in the conception of global history. If the latter is no more, can we now define contemporary historicism as historicism without a global history? The rise of memory is exploited by nationalist and populist movements worldwide. Moreover, populists and authoritarians, consciously and intentionally, view history politics as their primary instrument of power. Thus, the Polish Peace and Justice Party embraced the notion of history politics or polityka historyczna in the mid-2000s. In 2008, one of the creators of the Putin regime, Lev Pavlovsky, predicted that the politics of memory would soon become, I quote, the standard of politics as such. In this light, there is no surprise that the Kremlin has made historical memory central to its propaganda. Let me add that we are dealing today not so much with the so-called communicational memory, naturally transmitted from one generation to another, but rather with artificial memories created and promoted by various memory entrepreneurs in the interest of political manipulation. It suffices to refer here to the works of Pierre Marat and Jan Assmann, who studied this phenomenon in a lot of detail. The question arises whether the critical awareness of roots and context propagated by the historic term is compatible with the misuse of the past for political manipulation. I believe these are positive and negative sides of the same reorientation of Western historical thought. The most important thing here is the close interconnection between the historicization of our thinking and the decay of liberal democracy. Modern democracy, like communism, was born as a future-oriented, rationalist, and universalistic project. In contrast, nationalism, including its now prevailing far-right populist version, is a particularistic ideology that tends to be inspired by the past rather than by a project for the future. Left-wing populism also increasingly focuses on particularistic agendas, promoting memories of particular communities. To use Reinhard Koselleck's term, modern history-based ideologies born in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were oriented towards a horizon of expectations rather than the space of experience. The interpretations of the past were then dominated by a certain vision of the future. be that a liberal democratic future or a communist one. According to Francois Artaud, the present-day historical consciousness is characterized instead by present-mindedness or presentism. Our horizons of expectations have become very narrow, while the past, no longer organized by master narratives, has transformed itself into an incoherent body of fragmented memories. No matter how important and masterfully reconstructed some of those fragments are, they are hard to relate to one another because of the decay of master narratives. And here comes one of my most important points today. This is precisely because of that, those fragments are so easy to be understood emotionally. And that is why people easily give them symbolic meaning and consequently use them manipulatively. The transition from future-oriented to past-oriented historical consciousness is usually dated to the 1970s and 1980s, when the rise of historical memory began. Since then, history, politics, and memory wars have become central to present-day politics and culture. The modern idea of history born in the 18th century was based on a balance between universalism and particularism. This is also one of the main themes of my book, to which I referred to earlier. The decay of the master narratives in the late 20th century has profoundly disturbed this balance and has contributed to the rise of particularistic ideologies and ways of thinking. British political scientist Andrew Vincent describes this phenomenon as a drift to particularity, characteristic, according to him, of present-day political thought. The recent rise of memory politics is an essential aspect of this drift. Let me quote from British Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm. The political project of the left, inspired by the American and French revolutions, is universalist. It is for all human beings. American sociologists taught Gitlin as, if there is no people, but only peoples, there is no left. To conclude, my main point is that, beyond a certain point, using the past for political legitimation favors anti-democratic political projects and undermines the precarious balance between universalism and particularism, on which liberal democracy is founded. The fragmentation of history, the emergence of the identitarian paradigm, and the politicization of the past have intellectually prepared the rise of populism and have thus contributed to the current crisis of liberal democracy. In this context, the role of liberal education with an even stronger than before emphasis on critical thinking, universal values, and the tradition of Western humanism presents as central to any strategy of counteracting the connected forces of populism, neoliberalism, neo-authoritarianism, postmodernism, anti-humanism, and social media, which have called liberal democracy into question in recent decades. Thank you very much. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to see you. Just his picture of him.
Thanks a lot. It's great. We now open the floor to questions. Those in the internet, you can actually use both Q&A and the chat for questions. So please, if there are any, we will be happy to voice them. I'm sorry that the camera is blurred on our side. I'm trying to help you. So any questions both here in the audience or online? Yeah, I see the questions here. Okay, that's, yeah. Cancel the blurring. Yeah, okay, let me try. Maybe you're right. Oh, okay, here we are. Very simple. All right, let me. Yeah, now it's much easier. Okay. Let us. I hope everybody sees. Yeah. And now we'll see if there are any questions. Sorry for the time. Yeah, here. Yeah. So the question, I'll read Jonathan's question now. First of all, thank you, Nikolai. My question is there space for liberal arts and sciences in the current world? What lessons do we have from the experience for the meeting of this in Russia and elsewhere? For the meaning of this, for the meaning.
Thank you for this question, Jonathan. Actually, I tried to answer it at the end of my presentation. I said that the importance of liberal arts has become even greater than it used to be several decades ago, but on the condition that you interpret liberal arts with an emphasis on European values, American values, traditional European Western humanism, and what else did I mention here? Critical thinking, of course, universal values and the traditional Western humanism, which means that we basically should explore more to what extent we are able to reincorporate some aspects of the initial Humboldt project in the present day strategy for overcoming the crisis of well, I'm not sure whether, well, there is some kind of crisis in liberal education, but also there is some kind of crisis of social and human sciences, and more importantly, there is a crisis, and a very serious crisis of democracy, and I guess critical thinking and respect to universal values are among the most important, if not the only available instruments of overcoming this crisis.
There is a continuation of Jonathan's question.
If you could read it.
Yeah, sure, I will. And how do you think of liberal arts differently now that you have been in the US? Or do you think of it differently?
Well, yes, I do. I know now much better how American academia is organized, at least in large universities. And I know that the model that you have at Bard and that you also try to implement in Smolny is not the prevailing educational model in the United States. In fact, it is a minoritarian model, but some aspects of liberal education of this tradition are, of course, more broadly present in American research universities, technological institutes, and things like that. And I wish more elements of this small liberal arts colleges model of education could be once again incorporated in the curricula and pedagogical approaches typical of research universities. Also, my feeling is that in recent decades, liberal education is often used to undermine democracy. But once again, in case liberal education is interpreted over the emphasis not so much on universal values, but on particularistic interests and particularistic communities. And it's interesting that liberal education also allows for this kind of reinterpretation of what education or culture is about. And this also goes back, interestingly, to the German situation of the early 19th century, because of course Germany was also the capital of European historicism, and historicism was precisely a kind of intellectual trend which explored some particularistic ideas and clearly opposed them to universalistic values typical of the Enlightenment period. So there was a clash, but traditional historicism and even historicism of in its German interpretation somehow still balanced the general and the particular. It was all the time struggle, it was tension It was not easy to balance those things, but by and large, the 19th century, with the exception, especially of the late 19th century Prussian schools and nationalization of nationalist historiographies, more and more getting nationalized in other countries as well. With those exceptions, at least the first half of the 19th century managed to sustain the balance. In the late 19th century and the early 20th century, of course, it was powerfully challenged. But then in the post-Second World War period, it was once again for a certain period of time, for 3 or 4 decades, reestablished and most forcefully reestablished. Now it's once again going through a period of kind of uncertainties and decay. That would be kind of way I would approach this question.
Thanks a lot. Jonathan was thinking, looking forward to discussing.
Exactly, Jonathan. It would be great to get together.
There is, though, more questions. One is more practical, another is okay. Let me cite Andrei Rodin concerning your conclusion. Would be better to refer here to universal values without identifying these with the traditional Western ones, as you did, for no geographically or culturally defined value, be it Western or Eastern, can be genuinely universal?
Yeah, of course, you're exactly right. No value can be absolutely universal, and yet, there are values which have better chances to be a little more universal than some other values. And this tradition of universalism was most powerfully developed in the West, and I personally am very proud of this incredible achievement of Western civilization. And I'm not at all among the critics of Western hegemony, of Western cannibalism, of Western all bad things coming from the West. All most good things in history have come from the West. So universalism, for me, is a kind of very proud slogan. And the fact that this is just universalism is based on an essential tradition of antiquity, of Renaissance humanism, of Enlightenment, and so on, I think we have all reasons to be proud of that.
I think there are two questions, but I want to use this opportunity and to ask a question myself, although they are related. The other questions are why the example of Smolny was not followed by other departments, or why the Smolny was actually crushed only 2020 at the time it was. My question is a bit more general and related with the arguments where you compare critical, identitarian, universal, particular. There is another opposition, academic, and basically non-academic, if I read it correctly. And in this respect, academia is seen as a part which is able to think critically, and at the same time, again, returning to the role of education. And if we look at academia as a social institution, I really believe, in context of Russia, the argument that academia, that some disciplinary boundaries should be preserved. In a sense, it's exactly anti-universal. Anti-universalist. This claim for academic, for some disciplinary independence. So there is obviously a clash, but I'm wondering, how do you think about it right now in the Russian context? Like, what's going to happen? Let's imagine some remote future, the situation changes. What should be done then with the whatever academic culture is?
It's so difficult to answer this question because the circumstances in which theoretically this might happen are absolutely unpredictable. And of course, many things, when we begin, thinking about what can be done, the starting point must be clearer than what we can imagine about that now, because it's a starting point somewhere very, very far from us in the future. It's not going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, it's true, but we cannot, like, according to the argumentation, we cannot be without the image of the future. So what is the image here? If it's not an academic ivory tower?
Well, first of all, thinking about, academic ivory tower today, I would be far more positive than I used to be 20 years ago about that. At that point, I thought that opening social sciences more towards concrete issues of society life would be a very important thing to do. Now I think that they have opened themselves to this public life to a much greater extent than they should have done. No, I don't think that the certain return to some elements of ivory tower ideology would hurt very much. I think it would not be a bad thing at all, because when academia is all or subjugated, I use the word in the presentation, but perhaps it's too strong a word. Academia is largely under the control of activist movements. I'm sorry, it's not a good situation either. And it's very often, that academia falls under the control of those kind of activistic movements, of course, informally, but social media are about subjugating people informally to some kind of group pressure. And this group pressure, largely carried by social media, is a new factor. We didn't think about that. We didn't have to deal with that 20 or 25 or 30 years ago. There was simply no social media at that time, and they appeared much later, and they became powerful just a few years ago. And this is a new reality to which we have to adapt and to try to find out a kind of line of defense, a strategy for defending academia. We necessarily go back to some elements of ivory tower. In the new context, things look differently. And regarding the structures of academia, professions, and stuff like that, of course, this narrow specialization, narrow professionalization, and stuff like that, and that many people prefer not to somehow go out of their very narrow field of studies, and they don't care about what's happening in their neighboring fields, not to speak about more general stuff, more general discoveries on new attitudes that are getting more or less widespread in different, in very remote fields. Of course, this is that was not so good, and this is not so good either. The trouble, however, is that academic disciplines are part of an exceptionally important style of thinking. And this style of thinking presupposes a stratified image of the universe and stratified image of human society. And stratified image of human society is just what democracy is about, liberalism is about. Liberalism is based on the distinction between different levels of social life. Liberalism is based on the distinction between society and politics and state, between religion and social life and stuff like that. If religion is not conceptualized as a special level of social life, which has perhaps its laws and regulations and functions and mechanisms or whatever, and cannot be used as the foundation of social life at large, were it not for this separation of religion from other spheres of social life, we would have been all Islamic state. So I don't need to remind you that the core idea of Nazi ideologies such as Carl Schmitt and others was that, this Trennungsdenken, the style of thinking which somehow considers society as, divided into different levels of life. This is the core of liberal democracy, and they struggled primarily against that. Totalitarianism was essentially about overcoming this liberal separation of different levels of life. And those different levels of life, they cannot be considered outside the structure of the academic disciplines. Academic disciplines each deals with a separate level of life, theoretically. So interdisciplinary interconnections are very important. We of course need them, but we have to cherish the idea of levels of life and the idea of academic disciplines. Not so much, and not only because of some kind of professionalism, which of course developed standards within those academic disciplines, but also and above all, because this broader vision of society and life.
Thanks a lot. I would raise to, we do have other questions, so I'll probably ask. This is Susan Gillespie. Hello, Nikolai, and how nice to see you. I agree with your critique of identity politics. Can you talk about the presence of the aristocratic liberal education in Russia under the Tsars? And do you have an opinion about the rising influence of religious education in the US?
Hello, Susan. It's so nice. Unfortunately, I don't see you, but I am very glad you are present virtually here, and thank you for your question. Now, regarding the Tsarist Russia, I'm not sure I have a lot to contribute. The only thing I know more or less for sure is that the German model of modern university, German educational system was very much the foundation of the one that developed in Russia in the 19th century as well. But otherwise, aristocratic education was also from the 18th century on inseparable from things like traveling across the world and stuff like that, grand voyage tradition, and that was also, of course, to some extent liberal, but it was not technically connected to the notion of liberal education as developed within this university framework. Regarding the rise of the religious education, well, that's once again a kind of part of the crisis of democracy to my mind, because there's not only religion, things that we all thought largely overcome maybe 30 or 40 years ago, like nationalism and stuff like that, they are all back. And what is very tragic is that there are many people in academia who welcome them, who say that religion is something which is very necessary for its human beings are so isolated, they are so unhappy. There should be something which brings them together, whether it be a feeling of belonging to a national community or to a religion or whatever, because life in capitalist society is meaningless. Thank you. Life in any society is meaningless if you don't know how to invest meaning in that, right? And when people begin saying that religion is so great because it allows for overcoming, and this is largely from a kind of one of the components of the survival of religious or interest in religion everywhere in the world, this I think this is a kind of real tragedy. Technically, the religious education in the United States is, of course, as you know much better than I, on the revival. I'm not at all supportive of that, but fortunately still, listen, there are things which are much worse than that. Rising anti-Semitism, for example, is far more widespread, far more tragic than this rise of religious education, which is not a good thing either, at least in my mind.
One more question from Yeva Atanasov, professor of Port Berlin. Thank you for the stimulating lecture. If I understood you correctly, the rise of the politics of memory was prepared by a critique of Western humanism or universalism and the failure of its master narrative to properly include or their tendency to suppress human diversity. I'm thinking of Tsvetan Todorov's book, Human Diversity. If correct, are there aspects of this critique that you consider valid?
Well, I would need to give another lecture to respond to some elements of this question. It's difficult to explain the crisis of the future that began in the 1970s, basically, with some antecedents, especially in the United States in the 1960s. I would be very tempted to relate it more or less directly, although I understand that this doesn't solve the problem, the entire problem, to the changing models of economic development and to the economic crisis of the 1970s, and more broadly to what is sometimes called the coming of the age of diminishing expectations. At the same time, there may be other aspects also connected to some material stuff, which somehow contributed to the changing perception of the future. After all, in the 1960s and 1970s, and much higher, incomparably higher level of living standards were achieved in at least some Western societies, in most Western societies. And in a way, the image of the future at that time had already been implemented in the present. What the generations of our fathers, grandfathers, and we ourselves, when we were younger, dreamed about, that's what we have all around us. So these explanations, they are basically mutually exclusive. On the one hand, the first explanation would say that this is because of the crisis of the beginning of this phase B in the long-term economic development. On the other hand, the second explanation would say that this is because phase A was so successfully finished. It could be that both were somehow to some extent correct here. But once again, it's extremely complex to somehow to be minimalistically precise about that. You can have just rather vague, at least I can have rather vague general hypotheses about that. The second aspect of all that is that the tragic experience of the totalitarian regimes and the world wars, and especially the fact of the extermination of the Jews during the Nazi regime, but also the Soviet repressions, they became much more widely known in the 1960s and 1970s because of many different things, because of Frankfurt trials, or because even earlier of Eichmann trials, because of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, because of many things. And the fact that human beings prove themselves to be able to commit such terrible crimes, all this also undermined the belief of rationality and the morally sound nature of human beings and human society. I guess that different perceptions of who we are in terms of economic life and so on, what we can achieve, what our children will have that we don't have now and stuff like that. And at the same time, the realization that, listen, guys, we are so bad, basically. We're beasts, we're just awful creatures, we're capable of terrible crimes. All these things could very well go together. They could complement each other quite easily. Other things perhaps included even broader and more deeper transformations. This traditional vision of history, and I try to show it in one of my previous books, which is available in French and not only in Russian. This traditional idea of history was born in the context of a certain cultural space perception. It was a kind of culture which corresponded well to academic painting of the 19th century, a classical little band of three-dimensional space with the position of observer imminently fixed. And within this linear space, history presented, the hierarchical structure of levels corresponding to the levels of social life. was easily presentable as a kind of meaningful whole. And by studying historians' metaphors and stuff like that, we really see how much their representations of history, the logic of their argument was based on different paraspatial logics underlying their thing. Now what happened in the 1960s and especially the 1970s, and all the times happening since then, is that this traditional visual culture has gone out of use. With even television in the 1970s, and even more so with all source of computer stuff, starting from the 2000s, this traditional space of classical mechanics is a kind of atavism. This is a world which visually or paralogically has lost some kind of organizing principles, which for a couple of previous centuries allowed to present the world as logically coherent, because logic is largely based on references to space. And this fragmentation of our spatial experience, thanks to the development of new visual culture, thanks to the screens, right, could have impacted our logic and our perception of social world, everything, much more powerful than we usually recognize. So these are just several aspects that I would work among many, many others, because otherwise, I can speak for hours about all that, to explain this crisis of the future. And of course, another very obvious thing I don't want to talk a lot about, it's very obvious indeed, the crisis of communism itself, the most future-oriented ideology. So plenty of things were part of that. And from this point of view, of course, it was hardly avoidable. The trouble is that, as we often do, when we discover new experiences, stuff like that, we often say, well, all our previous ideas about that have to be thrown away. Necessarily. We can try to integrate some of the old ideas, relate them to some of the news to see where we should not, use straightforward arguments derived from, this classical mechanics with the vision, its vision of the world, and there is still some kind of this logic is usable. We have to be far more cautious than what is possible in the situation when activism has intruded into academia.
Any more? We do not. I believe we did have a couple of questions related to Kropotchev and other departments of the St. Petersburg State. I don't know whether Nikolai wants to comment on this.
Or should I?
Well,
they are all monsters. Kropotchev is a monster, Medvedev is a monster, Putin is a monster. What else?
Please.
Maybe
Please. The microphone is here. So.
Thank you for your presentation. And I'm sorry for my layman's question. I was particularly intrigued by the opposition you mentioned between meta-narratives and master narratives and fragmented memories. And my question is, what's the relationship between fragmented memories and the phenomenon of the counter memory or contre memoire, in which case I prefer? And just to follow up your reflection upon the fragmentation from the perceptive point of view, I just wonder if this fragmentation is a property of thinking, because we are just surrounded by the fragmented discourse and fragmented representations and culture that emerged after the postmodernism, during the postmodernism, represents a kind of challenge to this universalism from the point of view of historical census or not only from the perceptive point of view, but also from the point of view of representations that emerged in contemporary culture and literature and visual arts and so on.
Once again, thank you. It's a very complex question. We can only just share a couple of not necessarily very coherent ideas in response to that. Memories are indeed necessarily by their nature fragmented. But this doesn't mean that fragmentation or our capacity to present the fragmented world that we encounter as a child is the only way in which we can deal with the world. Our mind and our perception, just our perceptual structures like that, our senses, from the first not initial stages of the perception, already interpret the signals coming from the outer world in a certain way by imposing onto those signals certain more coherent systems than those signals present themselves. So by interpreting the world, and once again, there has been a lot of work done by psychologists on that, on visual perception especially, but not only. By perceiving the world, we already put it in some way, in some sense and order. And the more we reflect on this world, the more we impose different elements of order on the chaotic, fragmented perceptions that we initially have. And this is basically the only way we can deal with the world. And our language does the same work, because general names, I'm sorry, they impose uniformity where there is not necessarily a lot of uniformity. And can we do without general names? No, we cannot. It's impossible to have a proper name for every leaf on that tree, for every tree in this garden, and so on and so forth, right? We need general names, generalized spontaneous. So our thinking internally by its own structures is a combination of necessarily somewhat fragmented perceptions and much more generalized logic that on the different stages of perception and thinking we impose. So these mechanisms can hardly be changed. But nuances matter, and nuances matter very much. As you know, they say sometimes we share 97% of genes with chimps, and yet 3% make a difference, right? So 3% make a difference. And here too, slight, emphasis on some aspects of this perception interpretation, some emphasis on this kind of concept. And our concepts that we use are also based on an internal contradiction between general notions and references to concrete experiences. Our words of everyday language and our, especially concepts of human and social sciences are semantic monsters. One French sociologist called them semi-proper names. Once again, they combine some general, kind of meanings with references to concrete experiences. And by using a concept, we emphasize slightly more the general component or this reference to concrete experience. It may be kind of a very, very nuanced way of doing that, but this changes a lot. Once again, in some of my works, I try to analyze some recent conceptual, developments, changes in how we use social and historical concepts. And everything is a matter of minor details, but the general tendency is to towards a new logical balance. I call this kind of rise of the logic of proper names at the expense of the logic of general names. In fact, I'm trying to show that in my work that a sort of balance between the two logics was achieved basically by the end of the first half of the 19th century, and since then was occasionally called into question by basically nationalistic and right-wing politicians and reaffirmed by more liberal thinkers, right? But once again, very often it's a matter of nuances. I'm not sure whether it's an answer to the question. That was kind of at least a framework within which I would try to develop a more concrete answer.
Thanks a lot. I believe we have time for one last question. So comment. I believe we do not have any questions from the audience, and thank you for those online. Sorry for our silent format. There are some security concerns which led to this particular type of connection. So we already some thanks from the colleagues who already asked the question. I believe that all the Andrei, yeah, one more comment from Andrei. Problem with the traditional European universalism is that historically it tightly connected to imperialism and colonialism, both in theory and practice. What is your stance to this problem? Well, I believe you did.
Well, I'm not at all a supporter of colonialism and imperialism. I don't think, though, that we have to throw away the notion of universal human nature to respond to the claims that universalism is an instrument of Western hegemony. First of all, I'm not against Western hegemony. I would definitely prefer Western hegemony to Chinese or Russian hegemony. And there are no other challenges to Western hegemony, really, I guess, than those two countries today. So I think that the West still is a little better for all the problems that we all know about. And second of all, once again, if there is no universal human nature, I'm terribly sorry. There is no other way than just a war of everyone against everyone else. It's only on the basis of some kind of universal human nature, and we can have slight hopes that we can understand each other. Not necessarily today, but in some remote future. Otherwise, that will be just realpolitik in the sense of Carl Schmitt, and he was really a dangerous mind, as Jan Werner Müller called him once.
So, I maybe want to use again this opportunity for the last question. You mentioned about the algorithm. One question, and about Carl Schmitt. I believe there is a danger of Carl Schmitts in ivory towers. And Russia is a great example. There are a lot of expertise inside the country which helps actually to happen what is happening.
Sure.
So how do you prevent of re-emerging Carl Schmitts in the ivory towers?
We spoke before of the election. The only way I see in which it is possible to prevent the development of, if there is someone like Mr. Putin on top, doesn't matter whether everyone else is in ivory towers or not. The question is, what is the general logic of the system? And to prevent Russia continuing being this kind of really dangerous country from which, the nuclear apocalypse can come at any moment, to prevent, China to become the economic leader of the world and things like that. The response to that should be strengthen America. I am not a Trump supporter at all, but the key battle is to make America strong again, not in Trumpian terms. Of course.
Well, on this positive or not that positive?
Not that positive, because there is no one in the waters who can do it in America now.
Well, once again, I want to thank Nikolai for this great talk, and to everybody present here in the audience and online.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, recording.